Okay, so we're ready to go. It's good that you tuned in because this topic is quite complicated. It's what I call muscle metabolism. Not sure what your textbook calls it. It's the ways in which a muscle fiber cell either uses and generates ATP for energy. So I'm going to go to a whiteboard right away, and I'm just going to list this as muscle metabolism. I don't have my textbook with me here at Panera. So I'm just going to go over muscle metabolism. First and foremost, muscles can store ATP on their own. Just letting another student in right now. So that's the first thing to recognize is that muscles can store ATP. So I'm going to say fibers, but not very much. Store a little bit. And what that means is they store enough ATP just so that the muscle itself can start contraction. So next thing I'm going to do is list in order that a muscle and fibers use ATP. And it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. First, when a muscle first starts to contract, it uses stored ATP. ATP that is already stored in the muscle fiber. That's good, but the difficulty with that, the challenge of that is a muscle fiber can only store about 4 to 6 seconds worth of contraction. So I'm going to say it lasts for about 6 seconds. So if we want to sustain a contraction longer than 6 seconds, we have to go somewhere else for the ATP. The ATP that was stored has already been used up. The next place the muscle goes to find that ATP is called direct. I'll explain all of these 4 steps after I list them. Direct phosphorylation. I'll explain what that means. In one sentence, it means we just regenerate some of the ATP that's been used. Third, if a muscle wants to sustain a contraction for even longer, it goes to something called that's an A, anaerobic pathway. In parentheses, I'm going to write glycolysis because that's the actual process that is used. It looks like glycolysis, but it's pronounced glycolysis. And fourth, and finally, a muscle, if it needs to sustain a contraction for a long time, this is called the aerobic pathway. And the process that is used for the aerobic pathway is called cellular respiration. I'm going to explain what these 4 steps are after I write this. All right, so first a muscle does this, then this, then this, then this, if it needs to keep sustaining a contraction. So I'm going to layer on a new whiteboard and explain these steps 1 through 4. Number 1 is very easy. So I'll just remind you, a muscle first uses stored ATP for about 6 seconds worth of contraction. But then once that's used up, a muscle quickly goes to step 2, which is called direct phosphorylation. I'm going to explain what that means. before I explain the process of direct phosphorylation, a muscle can get about 15 seconds worth of contraction from this process. So when ATP is used for energy, you know now that it cuts off, it cleaves or terminates its terminal phosphate. So when it does that, so I'm just going to write the word, when ATP is used, what we have left over is ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate, plus P, a phosphate. We've chopped off that terminal phosphate, so those are the two products that we get when this molecule is used for energy. Now it would be nice if we could just glue that phosphate back on the ADP and reuse it again, and we can't really do that biologically. What we have to do is find another source for this P and stick it on the ADP to give us ATP again. That's why this is called direct phosphorylation, because we are just taking a phosphate molecule and sticking it back on the ADP to reverse this to get ATP. So I'm going to write this out. If this is the product that we have, ADP, that's used, it's in the used process, and we get this, we need to rephosphorylate it, stick a phosphate back on it to get a new ATP. And we use something called creatine. Our body uses something called creatine phosphate to do that process. This is where we're going to get that phosphate and stick it back on ADP, okay? But we need there's an enzyme that is used for this process. So if we borrow or steal this phosphate from creatine phosphate, we're going to end up with just plain creatine, because we steal this phosphate to form this. Now we have creatine and ATP, but there's an enzyme that makes this all happen, and it's called creatine kinase. So I'll explain this again. ADP is just the used up form of ATP. Think of it like that. It's missing that terminal phosphate. So we need to borrow from creatine phosphate, the phosphate molecule, stick it on the ADP, and this enzyme allows us to do that, and we end up with creatine and ATP. Now we can reuse this ATP again. So that's the second step, direct phosphorylation, that is used. So let's layer on and go to number 3, the anaerobic pathway. Let's say that you want to sustain a contraction for even longer than about 15 seconds. Then your muscles need to go to what's called the anaerobic pathway. And the process that is used during the anaerobic pathway is called glycolysis. And if you break that word down, it just means glycolysis, which means the breaking of a sugar molecule. So we can use glucose, which is just a sugar, and we can lyse it or break it, and that gives us energy. This is a long, complicated pathway. So I'm going to write glycolysis and lactic acid formation. I'm going to give you the easy version of this process. I know that most of you, that Bio 1 is not a prerequisite to take this course, so I'm not going to go into the full-blown process of glycolysis or this anaerobic pathway. I'm going to give you the simple version, which should be enough for you to understand it. So what we're going to do is this process involves glucose breakdown from blood or glycogen stores in the muscle. This word anaerobic means in the absence of oxygen. So oxygen is not needed for this process. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a glucose molecule. Just say you've eaten some food and you've got sugar in your blood. We can use that as an energy source to form ATP. That glucose actually has to get out of your blood and go to a cell, and it's in the cell that that glucose molecule gets broken to form ATP. So I'm just going to draw an arrow and write in the cell. When we break this, we break the glucose molecule, and what the result is something called pyruvate plus 2 ATP molecules. That's what our muscle needs to use. So we're using an energy source that we've ingested. That glucose molecule goes to our cells. It gets broken in half. In the absence of oxygen, so I'm going to write no oxygen, and we get this molecule called pyruvate, and we get 2 ATP molecules. Our muscle can now use that ATP to perform a contraction. And remember, this is about 30 to 40 seconds worth of contraction. I don't know if I said that before, but I'm telling you now. 30 to 40 seconds worth of contraction. Okay? This pyruvate molecule gets converted to lactic acid. So I'll write converted. In the cell, the pyruvate gets converted to lactic acid. When you're performing an exercise of any kind, like if I asked you to bend down, reach, touch the floor, and then jump up as high as you can and continue doing that for 30 to 60 seconds, you'd start to feel burn in your legs. That burning feeling you feel in your muscles when you're performing an exercise is the buildup of lactic acid. So your muscles are trying to make ATP to continue the activity, and they're using an energy source. They're also making this pyruvate molecule, which gets converted to this acid. That's what gives you that burn feeling, is the buildup of lactic acid. If you stop doing that exercise, this goes to the liver where it gets broken down very quickly. So that burn feeling goes away fairly quickly after you stop exercising. So lactic acid gets broken down in the liver. Okay, that's what you need to know about the anaerobic pathway, which involves glycolysis. Now I'm going to go to number 4. Let's just say you want to sustain a muscle contraction for even longer than 30 or 40 seconds. What your muscle cells use is called the aerobic pathway to make ATP. And this process is biologically called cellular respiration. And we have to have oxygen to do this. So this is in the presence of oxygen. It requires oxygen in order to proceed. So here's, in a few sentences, here's what happens in the aerobic pathway. If we start with the same energy source, it doesn't have to be glucose. Most books use glucose as an example because it gets broken down very quickly and easily. It's sort of the first energy source, but we can use fats or proteins. They just take longer to do. So this goes into the cell again. It does get broken down, And actually that anaerobic pathway happens first that I just described. Here's a cell. In the cell is an organelle called the mitochondria. We learned about that a little bit the first week. That broken down sugar goes to the mitochondria, and oxygen molecules that we breathe also go to the mitochondria. So we have an energy source and oxygen. They both end up in the mitochondria. Now, in the presence of oxygen, our cells can make a lot more ATP. So the result is we make carbon dioxide this way, we make water, these are byproducts, and we make 32 ATP molecules from one oxygen and one glucose. That's really efficient. That's what enables us to sustain contractions for a really long time, sustain muscular activity. But we have to have this. So I'm going to layer over this board one more time and reiterate. First, our muscle cells use stored ATP. This is just a quick review, and that's about 6 seconds worth of contraction. Next, our muscles use direct phosphorylation. That's supposed to be ORYL. And that lasts for maybe about 15 seconds. It's hard to write out here on this table outside. About 15. Get my pen back. Then our muscle cells go to something called the anaerobic pathway or glycolysis. And that can last for about 30, maybe 40 seconds if we're lucky. And if we want to go run a marathon, we have to use oxygen and use the aerobic pathway. I'm just going to write hours. And that's how your muscle cells generate ATP. So let's just say you're going for a run and you want to run really fast at the beginning. You're a sprinter. First, when you're taking your first few steps, your muscle cells use what ATP they have stored in them. I don't know if you've ever sprinted before, but we can all sprint as fast as we can and basically hold our breath for these 3 steps. For about 30 to 40 seconds, you can run or exercise full blast. And you don't really need to breathe in order to sustain those heavy muscular contractions. But then guess what? You have to start breathing, and you start breathing heavily, because if you want to sustain your activity, you need oxygen. So you get up, you start going for a run. Your first few steps, your cells do this, then they go to this, then they go to this, and after about 40 seconds, you have to start breathing heavily in order to get enough oxygen into your system in order to use this pathway. And this can, marathon runners, they can run for hours. They can sustain that activity for hours. And the reason they're making a lot of ATP, this is a slow process, but it makes a ton of ATP, and it requires oxygen and some sort of energy source. Whereas the step before that, glycolysis, this is fast. Our cells do this very fast. We still need an energy source, but we don't need oxygen. And we don't make very many ATP. We only make 2 ATP per sugar molecule. So that's the gist of how your muscle cells metabolize and produce ATP and the order in which they do it. Now, the next topic I'm going to cover is something called a graded muscle response. All this means is how our muscles, I briefly mentioned this in yesterday's lecture, how our muscles can vary, that's supposed to be an R, their contractions. Explain this a little more in depth. So we have what your book calls variable tension is produced. And I think the example I used yesterday was you want to pick up a pen or a pencil that takes very little muscular activity to do it. But if you want to lift a 40-pound bag or a very heavy suitcase, that takes a lot more muscular activity and more tension to be produced. So a muscle contraction can be graded in two ways. Whenever you see the word graded, just think it can be varied or variable. And there's two ways in which our muscles can do this. First, this is called temporal summation. It's also what your book calls wave contraction or wave summation. So I'm going to put that. I don't use that term very often. I learned it as temporal summation, but these are the same thing. And this means that there is a change in stimulus frequency. I'm going to put in parentheses from the motor neuron that is stimulating the muscle. So I'm going to draw a quick graph, a quick picture to explain this. If this is tension produced, when you hear the word or see the word tension, think of muscle strength. And if this is just a function of time, if we fire a neuron signal to a muscle cell very infrequently at a very slow rate, the muscle will contract and then it'll relax. It'll contract, then it'll relax. If we increase the firing rate from the nerve cell, meaning fire faster, more frequently, the muscle will contract, and then before it fully relaxes, we fire again, the tension will increase. And if we keep firing the muscle with a nerve impulse faster and faster, it goes like this, and it produces more tension, more strength. So if we increase the stimulus frequency, we get an increase in tension or contraction strength. Okay? So that's called temporal summation. The word temporal just means time. So we're increasing the firing rate from the neuron over time. The second way that a muscle contraction can be graded, I'm going to go to a new page here, is called multiple motor unit summation. That's a U. This is basically a change in stimulus strength. Not necessarily, it's not about time, it's not about increasing the rate. Actually, it's about increasing the number of nerve endings that we use to stimulate a muscle. So I'm going to put in parentheses, think of this as number of nerve endings stimulating the muscle. So the first one, I'm going to go back really quickly. This one was about time, changing the rate of stimulus. The one that I'm talking about now, the second way, is about changing the number of nerve endings. So it's not a function of time. What this means is, let's just say here's a muscle. And you know a muscle now is made up of hundreds to thousands of individual muscle fiber cells. Okay? If we stimulate, here's a motor nerve. And remember, each individual fiber must have its own nerve ending in order to fire. So I'm going to draw this. So that each individual fiber has its own individual nerve ending. Now, multiple motor unit summation is about if we can vary the strength of contraction of this entire muscle. If we only stimulate, say, this fiber and this fiber, that doesn't produce a very strong contraction. It doesn't produce a lot of tension. Now let's say at the same time we add more stimulation to more fibers in this muscle. If we do that, that increases the strength or tension produced. So what we're doing is we're increasing the number of fibers that get stimulated within a muscle. That makes sense. The more we stimulate, if I also stimulate this one, then the entire muscle is going to contract and we'll get a stronger contraction and more tension produced by that contraction. So that's what a graded muscle response means. I'm just going to go back really quickly. A graded response means how our muscles can vary the contractions, and they can vary their contractions in two ways. By varying the change in stimulus frequency, how quickly we fire nerve impulses to the muscle, and also by changing how many fibers or nerve endings stimulate how many fibers. That varies the muscle strength as well. The last bit that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try to keep this a little bit short today because I'm not at home, I'm in a public space, is I'm going to talk briefly about muscle fiber types, right? So let's layer on another board. Let me go to my black pen. I don't think your book, I don't have my textbook with me. I don't think your book titles this different types of muscle fibers, but it's in there, it's in your chapter. It has to do with, it's toward the end of, I think it's in 9.6, 9.7, maybe even 9.8, where they talk about exercise or getting close to talking about muscle use and exercise and muscle use. There are three types. Basically, in the human body, there are three types of muscle fibers. We all have all three types of muscle fiber, but we vary from person to person in how many of each type we have based on our genes, our genetics. So we all have a little bit different mix of these three types, but we all have three types. The first type are called slow. You know what? oxidative fibers. And this describes this type of fiber. It's slow in its contraction activity. It uses oxygen. So those are the key descriptions of these types of fibers. I'm going to give you some characteristics. These tend to be smaller in diameter. They are best suited for endurance type of activities, long endurance exercising. They have many mitochondria. That makes sense because they have to use oxygen to produce their ATP. The cells, the fibers, have many mitochondria in them. They are also high in myoglobin content. That also makes sense because myoglobin binds oxygen. So everything about these cells are the use of oxygen. They have a rich blood supply, so I'm going to write they're high vascularization. All right, and I'm just going to say they are used for, I already said they're used for endurance, so they're long activities, like running a marathon or swimming for miles, and they use oxygen. The second type, and there's 3 types total, are called fast. These are the opposite type of fibers from number 1. Fast glycolytic fibers. And the name describes what it is. They produce contractions very quickly, and they're also powerful. They use glycolysis, which is an anaerobic activity, so no oxygen is necessary. I'm going to describe what these are like. These tend to be very large in diameter. They are powerful. They produce powerful contractions, but they fatigue very quickly. Okay. They have very large glycogen stores. That means they store a lot of sugar. For the process of glycolysis. They fatigue quickly. That's a characteristic that I already mentioned. They tend to be white in color because they don't have very much myoglobin. These tend to be red in color, white in color. I'm writing low myoglobin. They also have very few mitochondria because they don't need them. They don't use oxygen. Okay, and the third type of fiber, so I'm going to layer over the top of this. These are intermediate fibers. They're sort of a cross between number 1 and number 2. And so there we call these fast oxidative fibers. So the name describes they produce fairly quick contractions. They also use oxygen. So I'm going to put, these are, they're also called intermediate fibers. They're sort of a mix between number 1 and number 2. And here's their characteristics. They are oxygen dependent. So they have to have oxygen in order to produce their ATP and contract. They also have a rich blood supply. So they're highly vascular. These muscles do not have a whole lot of myoglobin, so I'm going to just say not much myoglobin. So they get a lot of oxygen directly from their rich blood supply, but they can't hold on to that oxygen and store it. So they need continual blood supply. These contract quickly, hence the name fast. Contract quickly, just like the fast glycolytic fibers. They contract quickly, but they're more resistant to fatigue because of that rich blood supply. The last thing I'm going to say about this, these fast oxidative fibers, these intermediate fibers, these can be converted to number 1 type, slow oxidative, or number 2 type, which were the fast glycolytic, depending on our activities. So it is possible to change, well, these do, especially these fast oxidative fibers, it is possible to change our muscle fiber type based on our activity. I'm going to give you a classic example. If you say you want to be a marathon runner, and you train and you train and you train for months and years to be a class marathon runner, these fibers that are in your body, the intermediate fibers, the fast oxidative fibers, will be recruited to become slow oxidative fibers. They will behave and literally become slow oxidative fibers because of your marathon training. If you stop training for marathons and you decide you don't want to be a marathon runner anymore, they revert back to their original fast oxidative fiber state, so they can change. Likewise, let's say now you change your mind and you want to become a power weightlifter or even a sprinter, where you need a lot more fast glycolytic fibers. Once again, you start training to be a power athlete. These number 3s, these fast oxidative intermediate fibers, can be recruited and converted to fast glycolytic fibers. And then if you stop that activity, they revert back to their original state. So I'm going to stop there, guys. I'm going to take these boards off. So don't know what happened to our participation board, so I'm just trying to get back. Having trouble doing that. So I know you can still hear me. I'm going to stop recording. If you guys have any questions,